This is The Long Road to Publishing, the podcast where we hear from authors who have traveled a long and bumpy road to publishing their books. Whether you're just starting out on your own writing and publishing journey, or if you're all too aware of the many possible detours along the way, this podcast is for you. I'm your host, Eva Langston, author, writing instructor, and creator of Eva's newsletter for writers on Substack. Thank you so much for coming along on the ride. In 2015, Cynthia Swanson was living the fairy tale every writer dreams of. Her debut novel, The Bookseller, was a lead title with Harper and hit the New York Times bestseller list. Her agent sold the rights in 18 countries, and the book was even optioned as a film by Julia Roberts' production company. But less than a decade later, Cynthia was struggling to find a publisher for her third novel, so she made the decision to self-publish. This might sound like some kind of fall from grace tragedy story, but it's really not. I found Cynthia's story to be encouraging and empowering and proof that truly everyone's publishing journey is wildly unique, and maybe the only commonality is persistence and resilience. In self-publishing, Cynthia has found a freedom she didn't always have in traditional publishing. And as she says, there's no right or wrong path, only what works for you and what works for a particular book. And it seems like Cynthia's decision is working for her. I can't wait for you to hear the whole story. Before we get into the episode, I am doing a little book giveaway for the new year, so let me tell you about that. Since my very first episode was with Courtney Mom, I will be giving away a copy of her book, Before and After the Book Deal, a writer's guide to finishing, publishing, promoting, and surviving your first book. It's easy to qualify for the giveaway. All you have to do is share about the long road to publishing on the social media platform of your choice. Substack, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, TikTok, etc. This can be as easy as saying, I've really been enjoying listening to The Long Road to Publishing. You can include a link, you can include a picture if you want, you can post about a specific episode you really liked, anything. But keep it positive, I would ask. So that's step one, just sharing on social media about the podcast. Then you can email a screenshot of your post to longroad.pub@gmail.com. Or you can tag me in the post if it's on a social media platform where I also am, like Instagram or Blue Sky or Substack. If you are emailing me, make sure you email me from an address that you check, because this is the address I will use to contact you if you win. The deadline is January 15th. Feel free to share multiple times on multiple platforms, but your name will only be entered into the drawing once. And if you need to see these instructions written down, I've posted them on Instagram, Substack, and Blue Sky, so you can check there. And again, if you need the email address, again, it's longroad.pub@gmail.com. And that's it. On January 16th, I'll randomly select a winner and mail you a copy of the book. I've never done a giveaway like this before, and my fear is that no one will enter and I'll feel dumb and I'll have an extra copy of Courtney's book. So don't be shy. Please do enter. And now on with the episode, which I'm calling A Dreamy Traditional Debut and the Decision to Self-Publish. Cynthia Swanson is the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of the psychological suspense novels The Bookseller, The Glass Forest, and Anyone But Her. Cynthia was just named 2025 Indie Author of the Year by the Indie Author Project, has received the Colorado Book Award twice, and won the Willa Literary Award and the Indie Author Project contest. She is also the editor of the award-winning anthology Denver Noir. She lives with her family in Denver. In addition to writing fiction, she works as a content editor, developmental editor, and ghostwriter, and occasionally teaches writing workshops. And I will link to all of the places where you can find Cynthia online in the show notes, but you can find her on Blue Sky and Substack. So welcome to The Long Road to Publishing, Cynthia.
Thank you, Eva. It's really nice to be here.
Yeah, so you had sent me this Jane Friedman article that you wrote about your crazy publishing journey. And I was like, oh my gosh, yes, you had already been on my radar as somebody who would be a good guest. And after I read that article, which I will also link to in the show notes, I was like, yes, I want to hear the long version of this
The
story.
long road.
Yeah, because it seems wild. But before we get into that, I know your most recent novel, Anyone But Her, came out in 2024. So for those of us who haven't read it yet, do you want to give us the little elevator pitch?
Sure. Anyone But Her is it's psychological suspense, which all my novels are, and it is a mother-daughter story and a ghost story. It's set in Denver in 1979 and 2004. And 1979, the main character, Suzanne, is 14, and her mother is shot and killed during an armed robbery at her record store. She owns a little record store, and then her mother, Alex, comes back to Suzanne as a ghost and wants Suzanne to do some investigation into what might have happened around her murder, which the cops considered an open shut case. And then there's some repercussions that go on 25 years later when Suzanne is an adult.
Ooh, okay. So it's psychological suspense, but there's also a speculative element potentially.
Yep, yep.
Okay. I have to ask if you like the author Jennifer McMahon. Have you read any of her stuff?
Not, no.
Oh, okay. I'm recommending Jennifer McMahon because she writes, well, I don't know. I guess now I'm thinking maybe it's considered horror, but it's to me, I always describe it as psychological suspense with a speculative element. You know, there's usually
Mhm,
like a
mhm.
ghost or something supernatural going on that's very, it's still got that psychological element, that suspense element. Anyway.
Right. Well, and the interesting thing, I just want to comment on that is like because like I don't ever feel like I write horror. Like my ghosts, I don't want to call them friendly ghosts because that's not right. But it's not about like a zombie chasing you around kind of thing. And not that that's what a lot of horror is, but there's sort of that element of like, oh my God, there's this incredibly scary thing. And in this book, without giving a whole lot away, Suzanne's clairvoyant and she's expecting her mom to show up as a ghost, and she
Mm.
does. She does not expect her mom to task her with investigate my murder, but she does. She's kind of lonely after her mom dies and hopes her mom shows up as a ghost. So it does sort of have those speculative elements, but I don't think it stretches into. I definitely wouldn't classify it as horror.
Yeah, I guess it's well, this is something that I feel like I end up talking about a lot on this show is just those genre classifications and like, it's so hard to figure out where does this book fit and what if it's a couple of different things and but
Right.
all I will say is this sounds totally up my alley. I love it and I'm going to have to go read it right away. Okay, well, so this is kind of where you are now with this book having come out and having just been named Indie Author of the Year. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So, yeah, so now I want to go back in time and see if we can do the whole journey to get back up to where we are now. So, I know a lot of writers say, oh, I always wanted to be a writer. I don't know if that's you or not, but a lot of writers say that. But when do you feel like you actually got serious about writing?
I would say I was one of those, always wanted to do it. I took a little detour in college and went to architecture school, but I didn't keep doing that. And I ended up getting an English degree. And I worked in marketing and public relations, and I worked a little while for a technical writer. So I was always kind of working in the writing field, and I was always publishing short fiction. And this was, I'm going to date myself, but this was like in the 90s and early 2000s. And so I published a lot of short fiction. And because back then, that was sort of the avenue that was the common wisdom. You have to publish in literary journals, you have to get your name done because no agent's going to look at you if you don't do that. So I did all that, and I hoped I would be one of those, wonder kids in my 20s, and that didn't happen. But I did. I was working on novels. I wrote a couple of practice novels during those years, and this the first one I didn't ever do anything with except practice. But the second one, I spent a lot of time on it. I called it the 7 year novel because it did take me 7 years to write it. And I pitched it to a couple agents, and I got a little bit of interest, but nothing ever went anywhere. And then I got married kind of late in life. I was 37 when I got married. My husband was 39, first marriage for both of us. And we had three kids in 4 years, and writing just went straight out the window. I mean, like,
Oh, I bet.
you know how it is when they're little. And I mean, one of the key things that I did during that time was that I forgave myself for that. I didn't beat myself up over it. I was like, look, self, I just like writing's like a good friend. When it's time to get back to it, when it's the right thing, I'm going to know it. I just felt in my gut that I was going to know it. And that's exactly what happened. So when my older two kids are twins, so when my twins were 6 and my younger one was 3, I just had the idea for the bookseller one day. I mean, it just came to me like almost the entire novel, and I was like, Wow, this is a really solid idea for a novel, and it's the first idea I've had like this in, over 6 years. And I think it's time to get back to writing fiction. So I did. It took me, honestly, only 6 months to write a first draft of that novel. It was very bare bones. It was like half the length that the novel would eventually be. And I spent a couple more years after that refining it and working on it, workshopping it a little bit at Lighthouse Writers here in Denver, which is a nonprofit organization that does a lot of workshops, and I've been involved there for a long time. And then it was actually through Lighthouse that I found my first agent indirectly because I took a class there on writing a query. And I'd queried that previous novel, but I didn't really know what I was doing. And I knew I didn't know what I was doing. So I took a class on writing query letters. And the person I took that with, she used to be an agent at one of the big agencies in New York, and then moved to back to Denver, where she's from, and was freelance editing and teaching at Lighthouse and teaching in some other places. And I really liked her. So after the class was over, it was only a 4-week class. I asked her if I could hire her to be my developmental editor for the bookseller. So she did that. And it was a big jump for me. I wasn't working much. I was kind of picking up a little bit of freelance work here and there, but not much. We were really living on one income. And I talked to my husband about it, and I said, I really think I need to put some money into this because I really believe in it, and I need to make an investment in it. And he said, well, if you think you need to do that, then you should do it. Luckily, I have a very supportive spouse.
Yeah, good
So
job.
yeah, 23 years later, we're still married, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
So I did. And so I hired her, and she read the manuscript, and she said, look, I think you're about 90% there. This is really good. And I have some suggestions I would make. And if you want to make them, I think I know some agents who might be interested in this. And that's how I got my first agent, was through that connection. And that was summer of 2013. I sent her the manuscript, and I sent it, I'm in Denver, and I sent it at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday afternoon. And she got in touch with me, I don't think the next day, but the day after that. And she said, I have to tell you, I knew this was coming because of the connection. And I started reading it. And I actually was, going out on a date with my husband that night. And I really didn't want to leave because I wanted to keep reading your manuscript. And so we worked back and forth. And so I obviously signed with her. She was very enthusiastic. And I had pitched a couple other agents, but really not that many. I mean, I think probably, I want to say a dozen.
Hmm.
It wasn't that many. So she wasn't the first one that my developmental editor suggested, but she was on the list after we'd gone to a couple other people that passed.
It helped that when you have that connection, it's not like a guarantee that they're going to like it, but it puts you at the top of the pile. And she, like you said, she was like, I knew this was coming, and so she started reading
Right.
it right away.
Right. So I mean, if you ever get that kind of connection, you obviously want to talk to the person who's making that connection and make sure that they're going to send an email or a text or something to the person and be like, "Hey, I've got this author that, I really think you might be interested in, and her name or his name is so and so." And so keep an eye out for an email from them, and then make sure you put it in your subject line, recommendation of so and so.
Right.
So we worked back and forth for about a month or so on some refinements, some different changes to the manuscript, not that many. And then she took that out on sub, and this was September 2013. And we got an offer from Harper, Harper Collins, and it was a preempt, and which means that, do
Yeah,
I need to
yeah. Explain what that means.
so a preempt means that they had more than one editor who was interested in it. And so a house, instead of basically both their editors going against each other in an auction, the house just offers you some money, and it's usually a good amount of money. So that kind of, escalating thing doesn't happen. And so it was a very nice offer, and I took it. Then I got to choose my editor out of the two people who were interested, which was very actually really hard, because they were both great. I talked to them both on the phone, and I would have been happy going either way. So the bookseller came out in March of 2015, a year and a half later, and that's very typical,
Hmm.
for it to take 18 months, and it did because they'd made me a nice offer. They did put a lot of marketing muscle behind that book. They had NPR, they had a really good top PR person on it, and they got me some really nice features, and they just did all kinds of stuff. They sent a lot of arcs. They got a lot of stuff going. They got a lot of buzz, and it was great. So that book actually did really well. And it another thing that happens is that when something like that happens internationally, especially if you have a good foreign rights agent, and I did through my agent. So she was able to get me a number of foreign deals. I think there were
Oh,
18.
wow.
Yeah. So that was really great too. And so, I mean, like all these things happen. And I was just like, it's a fairy tale,
Yeah.
it's like, it's the miracle story. And you think, okay, this is how, wow, this is how publishing works. How cool is that?
Did it hit the New York Times bestseller list right away, or did that happen later on?
That happened later. It happened after the paperback came out. So it was like, yeah, so it was a year later. It was like summer 2016 when it hit New York Times bestseller list. And it was only for a couple of weeks. So which is pretty common, unless you're like a really well-known or you're just one of these debuts that just becomes sort of a reader favorite. And it wasn't that, and I've never been that. I mean, I have a good readership, but I'm not one of these sort of people who was a debut and has become a household name. I mean, we all know a lot of those kinds of authors, but there are also a whole bunch of people at my level who like get, where they're pretty well known, especially in their local area and somewhat nationally, and people kind of know who you are, but you're not like on the New York Times bestseller list for a year and a half or anything like that. So it was my situation, but I still felt like it was pretty good.
Well, yeah, to go from like, you had written a couple of novels that didn't go anywhere, then you were freelancing and parenting for years, and then all of a sudden you've got an agent, you've got a book deal, you've got 18 different foreign deals. Like that feels like the fairy tale to me.
It was and a movie option. We did get a movie option too from Julia Roberts.
Yeah.
So Julia Roberts' production company, Red Om, okay, that took a little bit. We signed that in 2017. So it took a little bit, but I knew it was, going to happen. And they honestly still have an option. So
Do they really? Do they just keep renewing the option?
yeah, and they really seem determined to want to do it. Like it's one of these stories that I think is just for whatever reason really near and dear to their hearts. I don't know if it's so much Julia Roberts herself as the people that are running her production company. And at this point, she'd be like producer of record on it, but I don't even know if she'd be in it. I think originally she thought she would, but it's been a lot of
Yeah.
years, so I don't know that it'd be a right fit anymore,
Yeah.
right? So the main character is 38. Not that Julia Roberts couldn't pull that off, but I don't know.
Right,
So,
right.
but yeah, it's still options. So who knows? I mean, we'll see. I'll keep you posted on
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Well, that's what I always hear about the film industry side is it's like don't hold your breath, but you never know.
My agent said to me that your book has been made into a movie when you're sitting in the theater eating your popcorn and watching it on the screen. Until then, anything can happen. So like, you don't count on it
Yeah.
any kind of way. But it's still
It's
fun.
fun to
It's
say.
fun to
Yeah,
talk
it's
about.
fun to say. Okay. So big splash. You're kind of like, wow, this is it. I've made it.
Much. Yeah, I was. I mean, I was like, okay, I've made it. And as soon as not even I think before the bookseller, yeah, I think I started writing The Glass Forest in like 2014. Well, we had edits going on for the bookseller. So I had another novel going. So, and I was like, well, I guess this is just how it goes, and I'll just keep continuing this and everything will be
You're like,
wonderful.
this is my life now.
This is my life now. I'm a career author,
Yeah.
and everything kind of indicated that for a while. So one of the big things that did happen though is between the hardcover coming out and the paperback of the bookseller, my editor retired. When that happened, they gave the project to get the paperback out to a different editor, and she did a fine job. I mean, that's when we had the New York Times bestseller list, and they did some other big promos and did a lot of ebook sales. And so she did a fine job. And then we had to give her the Glass Forest when it was ready to go because it was my option book. So you're like contractually obligated to give them your next book. And then, they can either make an offer or not, and you can either accept the offer or not. So, but she did a lot more nonfiction than fiction. And so she read it, but she wasn't that enthused. And so they passed on it. And that was like, I felt like a little setback there. But my agent was like, it's fine. We're going to find somewhere else. Don't worry about it. So she went out on Wide Sub with the Glass Forest, and this was like fall 2016. And I ended up at Touchstone, which was an imprint of Simon and Schuster, and they were great. My editor there was Tara Parsons, and she was really great. She's, dynamic, and the whole team there was really young and dynamic and cool. And they got that book out in February of 2018. So again, like a year and a half, which is pretty typical. And it did okay. It didn't do as well as the bookseller. I mean, it didn't quite get as much splashy coverage they had some other, it's funny about them because I love Touchstone, but like this, and they were like, your book's going to be our big book. And it kind of was, it was their big fiction book, but they also had a cookbook by Reese Witherspoon. So you can imagine where all the resources were
Right,
going.
right.
And Reese's cookbook came out at the same time as my, like the same date as my book. And I'm like, couldn't you at least get her to like, like recommend it or something?
Yeah.
But it was still, it was all right, and I was still happy with it. And we got 7 international deals, which was pretty good. So I was like, okay, things are fine. Things are still moving along. And, so then I kept going. I was writing another novel. I had one that was kind of a setback that I ended up just shelving, which happens. And then I started writing what would eventually become Anyone But Her. So it worked on that for a pretty long time. So it took me a little bit while to get another book that was ready, another novel that was ready. In the meantime, it was pandemic. When pandemic came along with that came the opportunity to edit Denver Noir. And that just sort of came along out of the blue. Like so Denver Noir is part of a series of noir books that are set in cities all over the country and all over the world. So there's like a Paris noir and a Boston noir and a Washington D.C. New York noir and a Beirut noir.
Oh,
Like, I mean,
cool. Yeah.
there's like 120 of these. So they're really cool. It's a little publisher, small press in Brooklyn called Akashic, and they've been publishing these since like 2004. So they didn't have a Denver volume and they were looking for a Denver editor because they always have a local editor. And my name came up. And so they got in touch with me and asked me if I wanted to do this. And this was like fall 2020. And I'm like, yeah, heck yeah, I'll do that. So I did. And it was a perfect pandemic project because I was able to, the authors are all local. But most of them I wasn't seeing in person. Some of them I knew, some I didn't. I had to curate that list based on some criteria that the publisher had put together of what they wanted for the collection. There's 14 authors in it. It ended up being just a really stellar, wonderful collection and a great group of people to work with. I will say it's the best group project I ever did.
Oh,
So, and so many of them have become good friends since then, which is really just lovely. So that book came out in the spring of 2022, and which was a great time to have a book come out because we were able to do events and be in person, and everything we did was local because it's a local based book. It was really stellar, and it won the Colorado Book Award that year. So it was a lot of fun, and really gratifying. It wasn't something that I made a lot of money on, but that was okay. By this time too, I'd started to develop my work freelancing a little bit more than I had been. So, I was ghostwriting, I was doing some developmental editing, I was kind of getting into some other projects and occasionally teaching, which is I still do all these things to this day. And then in the meantime, I had been working on Anyone But Her all that time. So the thing about Anyone But Her is, unlike my first two novels, especially the Bookseller, which, like I said, I really just kind of wrote, and the book didn't change significantly from that very first idea. But Anyone But Her, I rewrote top to bottom, front to back, completely 5 times.
wow.
Yeah. So starting in like the first draft I had done of it was in like spring 2020, and I had a couple of beta readers and they liked it a lot. And so I gave it to my agent and she read it. And at that time, I mentioned that it's a dual timeline story and that the character is 14 in the 1979 timeline. So that first version that I gave her had only the 1979 timeline. And she read it and she said, I like a lot about this, but this is young adult.
Interesting.
And I really hadn't intended it to be that. I really wanted it to be like sort of an adult voice looking back on this experience of something that happened of trying to investigate your mom's murder when you're 14 years old. But she didn't read it that way. And so I kind of thought about that a little bit. And I said, well, what if I add an adult narrator and kind of have an alternating voice? And she said, that sounds good. So I wrote another version of it. And in that one, I had the mom character, Alex, who is going to end up getting murdered. And you find this out in chapter 1, so I'm not giving anything away. I had Alex as the narrator before her murder, kind of like giving the backstory of what happened. And so, and going back and forth between, these kind of two timelines that were about 6 months apart in time. And I gave that to my agent. I spent almost a year writing that. And I gave it to my agent and she read it and she said, I really don't like Alex as a narrator, and this is still YA.
Ah,
So then I step back and I'm like, all right, I'm not doing that again. I'm not just throwing something out there. So I did what most authors hate doing, and I wrote a synopsis of a whole new idea that I had of this dual timeline with Suzanne as an adult and Suzanne as a 14-year-old. And I wrote it out as a synopsis. And so I paced out the entire thing. And I'm pretty much a pantser. I'm not really much of a plotter. I kind of have a basic plot usually, but not like a this happens, this happens, this happens. But I knew I had to do that. So I did. And so I wrote that out as a synopsis, wrote some sample chapters of that newer timeline, that 2004 timeline. And I gave all that to my agent. So, what do you think? And she said, I like this a lot. I think you should write this. So I did. And this time she was happy with it. And so by this time we were at spring 2022, which is when Denver Noir came out. And so she took that out on sub because the other thing that had happened is that Touchstone had folded, which happened 8 months after they got the Glass Forest out. And they farmed out their titles to other Simon and Schuster imprints, but it didn't have any support anywhere else. So we were going out on white sub again. So she took it out and because she liked it, and we just were not getting a lot of traction on it. And I really thought about self-publishing at that point. This was fall 2022. And I then one day I was talking to another author friend of mine and telling her about the book. She hadn't read it, and just kind of, giving her the basic story. And she said, I like a lot about this, but in that second timeline, like, who's the villain? And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, who's the villain? And I said, well, she's 40 years old and she's got kids who are a challenge and she thinks her husband's having an affair and she's trying to start a business, all that. And my friend said, who's the villain? And I realized she was right. Like there wasn't that same, layered mystery that it
Right.
was going on in the earlier timeline. And so I talked to my agent about that and I said, I'm going to rewrite it again. And I have some other ideas of how I want to rewrite this. And so I did. And so now we're up to version 4. And I gave that to my agent. And it didn't take me very long, like maybe 4 or 5 months.
Hmm.
But she sat on it then for like 3 months. And I kept reminding her and she wasn't reading it. And so finally, we just kind of had a conversation and realized that she just did not have the enthusiasm for the book. And I wasn't willing to give up the book. So we decided to part ways. And we've been working together for, by that point, almost 10 years.
Yeah.
And we're fine still. I mean, she's handling the bookseller ever ending, movie option thing if it ever happens. And so I mean it was amicable and it's totally fine. But it just, we were just at different points in what we wanted and what we wanted for my career. So I found another agent. It took me about a month to find another agent. And that is one thing that gets a lot easier when you're published like that. I basically like identified about maybe 8 or 10 author friends of mine who are publishing in my genre and were doing well and asked them, hey, will you connect me with your agent?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I got another agent. And my new agent loved it. And so she suggested a few changes and then she wanted to take it out on sub, but she could not go back to anybody that my first agent had gone to a year earlier because that's just how the business works. Like if they've seen one version of it, they won't look at it. And even if I'm like, no, 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 it's totally a
Yeah.
different book. They don't care. They just don't have time. So she found some other people to go to, but again, we just weren't getting the interest. And she was like, well, I could start going to small presses. And I said, I mean, I love small presses, but it just wasn't what I wanted. So I really started thinking about self-publishing it at that point. But before I did that, I went back to my developmental editor that I'd worked with on the bookseller, who's a dear friend of mine now. And I basically just straight out said to her, like, does this suck? Because I'm like, I'm not going to self-publish it if it does. And so she read it and she liked a lot about it. But the interesting thing she said to me was, she said, I cannot get a handle on that ghost. Like, is she a ghost? Is she not a ghost? What's going on there? And I realized that in all those other versions, 4 full versions of that book, I'd been really wishy-washy about
Mm.
that I had to, and what I really like about that is like she just raised the question. She didn't answer the question, she just raised the question. And the answer for me was I need to fully lean in on this ghost thing then.
Hmm.
And so I made Suzanne clairvoyant at that point and kind of really brought a lot more of the ghost element into the book. So it wasn't just sort of this blip on the side, and it made it so much stronger. And so, but then I had to go back to my agent and tell her that I was going to self-publish the book.
Well, yeah, I am interested in that because I guess I always have been in the understanding that, oh, well, if you have an agent, you can't self-publish, especially with a project that you've worked on with your agent. So what was that conversation like, and how did you kind of navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I just told her that's what I wanted to do, rather than trying to look at small presses. I mean, it was like I didn't know what she'd say, but I mean, I obviously had to tell her, and I was like, is she going to dump me? I mean, we just started working together, but I had to take that risk because I really wanted the book out, and I didn't feel like the direction that we were going with it was going to be the direction we wanted to go. But she surprised me. I mean, what she said was, she said, I totally support your decision. I think that's a good decision. I know you want this book out. And she said, do you want me to still try to sell the audio?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I was like, yeah, that'd be great. And she did. So she ended up selling the audio to Tantor, which just does audio. And so the audio for anyone but her is traditionally published by Tantor Media.
That's so interesting. I swear, every time I talk to somebody about their publishing journey, it's like some new thing that I didn't even know was possible, that you were traditionally published just for the audiobook, but then self-published the ebook and the print version, right?
And actually, I've since heard other stories of that happening especially if a self-published book is doing well. Sometimes an agent will come along, or if you already have an agent, and be like, "Hey, I think I could sell either international versions of this or audio versions or some other auxiliary rights." So, which is, so it's kind of cool that you do have those other options that are out there. I have a friend who I know that she's got an agent. She self-publishes everything, but she's got an agent who does international for her, and she's got a couple of international deals that way.
Now I'm like, I wonder if I should talk to my agent about self-publishing some of my manuscripts that didn't sell, because it's not something I've ever like people will ask me sometimes and be like, "Oh, well, why don't you self-publish those?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't know. I worked on them with my agent." But now I'm like, well,
Mhm.
it's maybe it's worth a conversation. I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't think it doesn't have the stigma it used
Yeah.
to. It used to be like if you self-publish, that's it. You're never going to get an agent, you're never going to get a traditional deal. And that's no longer the case. You probably won't for that manuscript unless you're one of these people who like it just explodes and sells thousands and thousands of copies. And then I can't remember who the author is you were talking to.
Oh, Rebecca Thorne.
Yes, yes. I was like, holy cow.
Yeah, she had the opposite journey from yours. Yeah.
She totally did. Yeah, she totally did. But she's writing in genre, and she's on TikTok. She's like doing all the things that you'd want to do to have that
Yeah.
journey.
Yeah.
So,
But I do think it's true that self-publishing does not, I think there's maybe still some stigma, but it's not at all like it used to be. It's very, very different now.
yeah, and you know who doesn't care?
Well,
Readers.
that's
Readers don't
exactly
care.
what I was saying to Rebecca Thorne is readers don't care, nor do they even know a lot of the time. They don't know if it's
Nope, they
self-published
don't.
or not, as
Nope.
long, as long as you've done a good job with it.
Right. And that was, I mean, that was one of the things about anyone but her, was that I did make the decision when I decided to self-publish it. I said, I'm only doing this if this book can be as high quality in content and in design as my big five published
Yeah,
books. And so I put the money into it. I invested in a great cover. I don't know if you've seen the cover, but I mean, I think, I'm really happy with it.
it looks great. Yeah.
And I wanted to make sure it looked as high quality. And some books now, if you do put the time and the money into them, can look just as great as a traditionally
Yeah.
published book. So I mean the technology's gotten way better. The print on demand is way better. Yeah, so those are some of the reasons I think that the stigma's not going away too. But you got to put in the effort. You got to have the quality be as high quality as you possibly can. You can't cut
Yeah.
corners. And I 100% believe that. I would never do that just because the book is self-published.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. So has your agent also been working on international deals for anyone but her?
She said keep let me know how the sales are going. And I mean the sales are decent, but they're not at a point where like an international publisher would be like, yes, I want this. So I think I would really have to get the numbers up, which honestly I could do by putting a lot more advertising into it. And that's a whole thing about self-publishing, the promotion that you put in and the investment that you put into promotion. So it's a really interesting kind of balance of like, how much do you want to do that? And for me, because my situation was a little bit different, because I already had a following, I sort of made a decision of like, this is how much I can budget for this, and we'll see how it goes. and then I kind of feel like the book has a long tail. Like I don't have to do everything right now either. It's not like when the bookseller came out, and it's not like it is with Big Five where they're like, we're making a big splash, and then that's it,
Right.
which is kind of how it goes most of the time with Big Five publishers. But when it's your own book, you can be like, I didn't make a big splash last month, but this month I think I will. I have a little windfall of money, so I'm going to do some more advertising or whatever it is you're going to decide you do. So there's a lot of freedom with it in that you can kind of make those decisions for yourself. But I know that one of the things you wanted to talk about, and we already talked a lot, is the pros and cons of both of those routes. And that is one of them to me, is that there is a lot more control over those kinds of situations and those decisions when you self-publish. So you can decide this would be a great month for me to try to get a book club deal or try to, and do some other big splash. But you sort of like weigh all that, and there's nobody else that's making that decision. And when you're traditionally published, you're not making those decisions, but sometimes they make them for you, like they did for the bookseller and a little bit for the glass forest, and they're phenomenal.
Right.
But you don't know, you don't know, and you don't usually have a lot of control over it, depending on where you are in your publishing journey. But the thing that you get out of traditionally publishing that is really hard with a self-published book is the distribution.
Mm,
It's really hard, especially for print books. And I had kind of made a decision that I was going to be okay about that. Like it's my local bookstores. I have a really great relationship with indie bookstores. I mean, the bookseller is about an indie bookseller. So, I mean, it's just those are my people.
yeah.
So I have good relationships with my local ones, and they'll carry it. But I know that it doesn't have the reach that I did of getting into Barnes and Noble or getting into indie stores and other places that my traditionally published books did, which is, it's one of those things that like there's just not a lot I can do about it. I mean, your biggest way to sell books independently is Amazon,
Right.
and it's just, and I'm not crazy about, handing over money to Amazon. Like it's just I would certainly rather people buy their books independently. So there's pros and cons. There are pros and cons both ways. The speed is like you can't beat that with self-publishing.
Hmm.
You can do it. I mean, once I made the decision, it was 6 months before I had a book out. And that just doesn't, by the time you get an agent and your agent pitches the book and you get it, and you go through all the things for traditional publishing, it's a long time. It's a long process. But if it's a dream to do, I mean, I don't regret doing it, and I'll probably do it again. I actually just talked to my agent this week because I have two books in the works, and one is a collection of short stories, which I'm going to self-publish because it's small and it's easy, and it's there's not a big market for it, but it's just something that I've been working on this year and really want to do,
Hmm.
so I'm doing it. But I also have another novel in the works, and I said, I hope you want to see it when it's done. I'd love to work with you again. And she said, absolutely, I definitely want to see it.
Well, that's nice to know you have that option and you're like, okay, maybe, I don't know, maybe with this novel you can try for the traditional publishing and then you've got the self-publishing to do if that doesn't work out.
Exactly.
But, you're talking about with self-publishing, the distribution is the challenge that you're not getting into the bookstores. But then I feel like so many people buy everything online these days anyway. I wonder how much it even makes a difference. But then,
Yeah.
as you said, then you're like, ugh, everybody's buying things on Amazon. Is your book, I should have checked ahead of time, is your book available on Bookshop? Anyone but her?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, which is great. Yeah. When you self-publish, the cool thing that you can do is you can have your book available through Ingram Spark, which is a branch of Ingram. Ingram is the main distributor of print books in the US. And they have a branch for self-publishers called Ingram Spark. So you can upload your book to Ingram Spark, and it's there and it's available in for any bookstore anywhere in the country to order. So my book is, you can walk into your local bookstore right now or go onto Bookshop and order a copy. 100%. And that's true of most self-published books, but having them actually sitting on the bookshelf in an indie bookstore or in a Barnes and Noble, that's a little bit harder to do.
Right. I do want to hear a little bit more about maybe sort of the difference of your experience with how much or what sorts of marketing and publicity you did when you were at the Big Fives versus what you did with self-publishing and I don't know, kind of your feelings about that.
Yeah, so I mean, when I started with the bookseller, the one thing that I did spend money on with the publicist was to do social media because I knew nothing about social media other than being on Facebook personally. I didn't have a Twitter account. I didn't have anything else. I had nothing. The Instagram didn't really even exist much. This was 2013, 2014. So I did hire a publicist that helped with my social media, and she helped me put together a Facebook page and got me onto some promos that built up my Facebook following. So I ended up building up a really nice, especially Facebook following. And I mean, I'm of a generation where most of the people that are my generation are that's where they are
Mm-hmm.
for the most part. Is some are on TikTok, but they're on Facebook and Instagram, and so that's where I built my following. And I did that for years and years and years. And then in the last like year or so, I've really kind of taken a step back from it because I'm just not crazy about Meta and their business model anymore. And that has been really, really hard. And I still go back and forth about how I feel about that. I still have accounts there
Mm-hmm.
and I will post something there occasionally, but I kind of feel like I've gotten to be that person that nobody likes on those sites that just post when there's like something I want to tell everybody about what's going on with my work. But so I got on a Blue Sky, which I do like, but it's a very different environment and it's hard to build a lot of traction there. And really where I'm trying to build the most traction right now is Substack.
I was going to say, I think that's how you got on my radar was through Substack.
Yeah, I think both of we came onto each other's radars through Substack. And I'm a lot of authors and readers and people in the literary community are coming onto my radar through Substack.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that. I do feel like Substack is trying to build that reader writer creative community. And I do like that. Do they have limitations too? Are there some issues? Yes. But I feel like that's going to happen anywhere. And I had been sending my newsletter through MailChimp for years. And so I moved all of my MailChimp, imported all of those contacts into Substack. And that's what I do now. It's my Substack is called the What If Journal. And that's my newsletter. So I really don't want to like jump ship again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so I'm hanging with it. I mean, I'm gonna hang with those. And I mean, I post on LinkedIn if something happens. But I don't have a good answer. And I feel like a lot of people don't have a good answer. I talk to so many people, whether it's professionally or personally, who are like, yeah, I don't really want to be on Instagram anymore. I don't really want to be on Facebook anymore. But that's where everybody is, and that's where all the conversations are. And
Right.
so it's really a tough one.
Well, and I think I told you that personally, I had the same thing where I had really stepped back from Facebook and Instagram. And then when I started this podcast, I went right back and I was like, well, I got to get the word out. But then also, I think the question is like, does social media sell books? I don't know the answer. I don't know if anybody knows the answer. I think it's probably one of those things where like you see and hear about the book in multiple places. Like, oh, I heard about it on a
Mhm,
podcast, and
mhm.
then my friend told me about it, and then like saw it on Instagram, and it's all of those things combined. So, how much is it hurting you to not be on those sites? I don't know.
What it's hurting me in more is I really miss the connections,
Mm,
especially on Facebook because I was at the point where I was starting to have some really interesting conversations with readers and great connections with readers through what I would post or what I would comment on. And it's just sort of that level of like, were people buying my books? I don't know, but I was feeling like I was part of a community. And so I am starting to feel like I have a little bit of that community at Substack. So I think in some ways, like for me, I don't put it all around. It's about book sales. It's about book sales. And that's just, I mean, I know that some authors like they do really, really well. And that's why they don't have to like ghostwrite and do content editing and do copy editing on the site because they're doing really, really well by, putting all of their efforts into that kind of promotional stuff. But to me, it's really never been about that. Like, my books have been successful and I love having large numbers of readers, but really more what I want is connected readers who, actually send me comments and say this book really meant a lot to me, or will you come to my book club, which is meeting like I mean I go to book clubs all the time in the Denver area, and I'm not talking about those weird promos that people are getting where they're like, we have a book club with 4,000 people and if you give us $300 we'll promote it, and it's
oh, is
like,
that a thing
no,
now? Oh
I'm
gosh.
talking about, I mean, I get emails from people who are just like, hey, my book club of, half a dozen women gets together and drinks wine on a Wednesday night and talks about a book. Will you come talk to us? And I do.
Yeah.
I go to every one of those and I bring a newsletter sign up sheet, and those people stay connected to me and they follow what I'm doing. And those have sort of become my people.
Yeah.
And it's a small scale thing, but I'd rather be small scale and genuine than large scale and really like have, really no connection with people.
Yeah. Well, and those are the people that are going to stick with you with self-published books. And I mean, I think that's a very healthy way to go into it because I don't think anybody should be writing books to make money because it's such a variable. I mean, as you are the perfect example, like somebody who has a bestseller and then, down the road, like can't sell your next book, like it is just, you never know. So doing it for the connection and for the love of telling the stories and getting the feedback from the readers who are enjoying the stories, like that seems like the most rewarding thing to me anyway.
Yeah, and that lasts a lot longer and you have more control over it. I can make more of those conversations happen by continuing to connect with people, whereas I can't do anything about my big publisher saying, we're not going to buy your next book, or our sorry, our imprint folded, and there's nothing we can do, and good luck to you, and we wish you the best.
Yeah.
There's so much stuff that's sort of out of your control. You have to find ways to move on to the next thing. But if you're building those connections, then that's one of the things that can sustain you through all that.
Yeah. Well, and like you said too, a book having a long tail where like it doesn't have to perform like crazy at the beginning. And I think that is, like you said, something that the maybe the big five sometimes loses sight of, that people tell other people who tell other people, and you get sort of this slow burn of readers that find your book. Okay, so I did want to ask you one thing because Anyone But Her came out in 2024, but then in 2025 you were named Indie Author of the Year. So how did that happen? And yeah,
So, through the Authors Guild, which I highly recommend to everybody belong to, Authors Guild is fantastic. They have wonderful discussion groups with some really, really knowledgeable people. And I saw in there, in like just before Anyone But Her came out in that spring of 2024, I learned about something called the Indie Author Project, through the Authors Guild. And the Indie Author Project is a nonprofit that their goal is to connect libraries and librarians with independently published authors, self-published authors. So they run a contest every year, and it's in, I don't know how many, maybe a dozen genres that they have, and it's free to enter. So I entered Anyone But Her, and it won in mystery thriller. So it won that, and that was like maybe November of 2024. So it was after the book came out. So it was really nice. It was the first award that it won, and it was really kind of a nice boost. And then what they do is anybody who won in one of their categories that year, next year, is eligible to be what they call Indie Author of the Year the
oh,
next year.
okay.
So, it was interesting because they got in touch with me, and they said that, and they said, we're going to be naming Indie Author of the Year, and you're one of the people who's eligible for it. So, we know about your book and everything, but can you write a little something for the judges? And the judges are from like Publishers Weekly and Library Journal and places like that. And so I wrote about kind of what we've been talking about this traditional to indie journey and the kind of back and forth that could be involved in that. And I was like, yeah, they're probably going to prefer somebody who they can kind of launch who's like at the start of their career. So I was a little bit surprised, but I think that they liked it because it was, my story's unique and it's different than a lot of indie published authors' journeys, which start out indie and sometimes then end up going traditional. Like not that many people do what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I've actually yet to run across anybody. So, but they've been great. I
Yeah.
mean, the Indie Author Project has been wonderful. They've got like they're hooking me up with like seminars I'm going to be giving online, and they're sending me to ALA in Chicago, American Library Association. They're really lovely, and I do highly recommend them for anybody who's independently publishing to look into the Indie Author Project.
Yeah. So interesting. Okay, well, I know we're going to have to wrap things up soon, and you've maybe already touched on this, but maybe you have something else to say. I always ask, what is something that has surprised you on your writing and publishing journey? Probably lots of things, but it can be something good, something bad, one of each.
It's yeah, right. I mean, what hasn't surprised me, right?
Yeah.
I think probably I'm trying to think what's the most surprising thing. I think the most surprising thing is just realizing how resilient you can be as a person and as a writer. I try to take everything as a learning experience. And I look back at who I was, and I'll especially address this to the younger writers that might be listening, because the things that have happened to me that were fairy tales, and the things that have happened since then If I was in my 20s or even my 30s when they were happening, I probably would have been devastated and I might have given up. And I think that's just because I probably wasn't very mature at that age, and there certainly are people who are. But I think it's just a matter of like learning that you really do have resistance, and you have to build a thick skin in this business because there are always going to be setbacks. There's always going to be something unexpected that will set you back, but you have to decide, okay, how am I going to work around that? What's going to be my next thing that I would do?
Yeah, that's a really good thing to find out about yourself is how resilient you actually are. And I know I was thinking about something you said a little bit ago in our conversation about you had an agent and already and you had like written a novel, but it wasn't quite right. And so you just kind of shelved it. And I've had that experience too, where I think I'd had one novel die on sub, and I was on sub with another novel, and I was writing something new, and I finished it, but it just didn't work. And I showed it to my agent. She was like, nah, this really isn't working. And I was like, yeah, I'm just going to put it away. And I think if you had told me at like 21 that I was going to like spend all this time writing a whole novel and then just kind of like shelve it and start something else, I would have been like, oh, how that sounds horrible,
Yeah,
you know. But
right,
but you
right.
realize like oh, like there will be other books, there will be other ideas. I'll take a little break and then I'll get my energy back and start again. And, I'll weather the rejections and I mean, for you, you've been kind of like quote unquote orphaned twice. You're on your second agent, like all of these things, but here you are and you keep going and find a new way. So, yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. And you have to take all those kinds of experiences as a learning experience. Even like that whole version of the book that I spent almost a year writing, and my agent said, I don't like this. And it was the mother character telling the backstory. Like none of that ended up in the final book, but it still really made the writing that I did subsequently about that character much better because I knew her better because I've written basically an entire book about her,
Yeah. Yeah.
even though that's not anything that's published anywhere, but I know it. It's in my head. And so it did help. I mean, I always think those things are they're still learning experiences, which isn't as fun
Yeah.
as,
And
getting a big splashy publishing deal, but it's part of the
And maybe
process.
you can't think that while you're doing it, but in hindsight, you can look back and be like, yeah, because I think with the one that I was talking about, the manuscript that my agent didn't really like, it was a new genre. I was trying to write in a new genre, and I think it taught me a lot about that genre. And then I was able to do it again, but do it better. So I don't know if like I needed to know that at the time, but like in hindsight, I can be like, yeah, that was actually really helpful. Like no wasted words or whatever. But yeah, well, I end every episode with a tip for the road for our listeners. So do you have maybe one particular tip that you want to impart to people listening?
Say my one tip is to trust your gut. You know yourself better than anybody else. And it can be so difficult in this business to not just get paralyzed by self-doubt. Because as we talked about, there are so many setbacks. And these great things happen and then you feel really good. And then, you see a one-star review or some other thing happens or you get a rejection or whatever it is. And it can just make you feel like I suck. I don't know what I'm doing. And so I think just knowing the stuff that is worth keeping and the stuff that's worth shelving, because some stuff is worth shelving, but just kind of in your gut, knowing that yes, this project, this is worth it. And I'm going to keep fighting for this and I'm going to find a way. And just realize that there are a lot of ways to do it.
Yeah.
There's no singular path that is the only path that makes sense. You just trust your gut and find the one that works for you.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point too. Some manuscripts are worth the years and years of revisions, and like if you look at you did all of those five huge revisions on Anyone But Her, whereas there was this other manuscript that wasn't working. You were like, I'm putting it away, and that like, who can decide that? Really, only you can decide. Trusting yourself, and well, and also going back to, was it your developmental editor said like, what's the deal with the ghost? Is it really a ghost or not? Like having the trust to make a decision and not leave things wishy-washy to be like, you know what? If I'm making it a ghost, I'm going all the way in
That's right.
and
Yeah.
making
Right.
a
Yeah.
creative
Going all in.
decision.
Yeah.
and kind of
Yeah.
trusting your gut on that. Yeah, I think that's very good
And that's
advice.
where the fun is, right? I mean, if you're going to do it, like you got to have fun with it. And I wouldn't do it if it wasn't fun. I mean, it's too hard
Yeah,
to take it
yeah.
out. Who would want to do this if it wasn't fun? So you got to make sure you're having fun.
Definitely. Your story is so interesting and I like that you're leaving the door open to both. You're like, maybe this next novel will be traditionally published, maybe I'll self-publish it, and you've got the short story collection in the works too. So I can't wait to see what comes next from you. And I am definitely going to have to read Anyone But Her because I love I
Thank
love
you.
a clairvoyant, I love a murder mystery. It all sounds delicious to me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eva.
Thanks so much for listening to The Long Road to Publishing. All the books we discuss on the podcast can be found at my bookshop shop, the link for which is in the show notes. You can find me online on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Substack with the handle Eva Langston. Even better, subscribe to my newsletter for writers at evalangston.substack.com and feel free to send me an email. The podcast address is longroad.pub@gmail.com. The Long Road to Publishing is produced and edited by me, Eva Langston, and the intro-outro music comes from the artist's sound roll on Upbeat. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and I'll be back soon with more publishing stories and more tips for the road.